All right, how's it going, y'all? Skylar and I have been on this call for like half an hour just catching up, so we decided to finally press record on it. And I'm sure I'll have some nice intro before this that'll give some more explanation of what we're doing here. But in short, Skylar and I are currently working on some educational material with some of our peers. And in an effort to kind of draw up some inspiration for that curriculum, I was going through my computer and my Google Drive just to see what I had written about in the past and some of the topics that I had covered since I began powerlifting coaching back in 2016. And I found this, we'll call it a blog article. I think I paid for some free, or paid. I had some free website and I added this to it. And I was probably the only person who actually read it. But I found this on my Google Drive. And I thought it would be kind of fun just to go through it and critique it, but also find things in it that are maybe applicable and could be applied in a modern powerlifting setting. Because a lot of the stuff in here is a fairly outdated take on powerlifting programming. But I do think some of the stuff in it's kind of cool. And I know, Skylar, you had a chance to look through it.
Yep.
You said that for a 20-year-old who had, zero experience, it might actually not have been a terrible write-up. But what were your initial thoughts on it? And obviously we'll be reading through here shortly, but.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was pretty solid. Like you said, for someone who's in their early 20s, like, not bad by any means, probably ahead of the curve. But the bigger, kind of goals of the article, or kind of the idea of like peaking or tapering into a competition, was very big manipulations of training volume, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yep.
And, part of the goal of the article, it seems to kind of talk about making peaking and training, or your training environment, pretty predictable. And I'm kind of the opinion that with, like, when we're designing training blocks, if we find something that's fairly successful, like we get a dart on the board, we want to kind of keep things fairly similar in terms of training dosage from block to block, rather than these big uphauls, because that can lead to a very different training response. So very big dips or spikes in volume and intensity, I try to minimize those. That was one of the bigger things that I saw in the article, in terms of, like, trying to, what is the word I'm looking for? Things to, like, critique or update. So maybe we could even just start there.
Yeah, that'd be fine. I mean, it was interesting when I read through it, because I think I was actually onto some good stuff.
Yeah.
This was an interesting time where, like, I was probably reading more research on performance, but I had zero or very little experience. So you're seeing, like, the true undergrad effect sort of happen here. I think about the bell curve meme, where it's like I was the nerd at the top of it who knew absolutely nothing, but I thought I knew everything. And what was that? I forget the Dunning-Kruger effect or whatever, like being on top of Mount Stupid. Yeah, I was there, but I thought I knew absolutely everything. And I was reading through it, and it was kind of this, like, emotional roller coaster of, wow, I was really stupid. But then I would make a little caveat that said, like, just to be clear, this is just to describe a volume taper. This is not what I would recommend. And I was like, okay, good, because you'll see here shortly that some of the like, theoretical programming examples, I was like, Jesus Christ, I hope I wasn't actually recommending this to people, because they weren't great. But starting with the title, I thought this was kind of funny that I put thoughtful programming methods. Only reason is because one of the first texts that I read was called A Thoughtful Pursuit of Strength by Juggernaut Training System. So you can see that I was indoctrinated and had zero unique thoughts at this point in time. Found this cool picture of me squatting, probably not very much weight. And starting, I'm not going to go through absolutely every single word here. I had an intro that talked about how tapering can help you peak for a competition pretty much here at the start. And then I got into defining terms. Maybe we start there. I think they're all actually pretty solid. I'd agree with all these still. The one thing from the peaking phase here, I say that a reduction in total volume coupled with an increase in overall intensity and specificity is characteristic of this phase of training. That is true. At the time, I think I thought that a really big reduction in volume was necessary. And that's what we'll kind of get into here, as being something that's probably a little bit of an outdated approach. tapering, it's a fairly straightforward definition there. You'll be able to read through and see all this during the video. I talk about like differences between overall and subjective intensity, which is a very important discernment there. But yeah, is there any other definition on here that you can think we really need to go through? I mean, these are, if you Google these, this is what you're going to find.
Yeah, these are all pretty straightforward, to be honest.
Cool.
Yeah.
So now getting into what the research on tapering says. I think I only referenced these two studies from it, and I can't remember because it's been 7 years since I wrote this, 7, 8 years. I can't remember if these were like meta-analyses or if these were one-off studies, but I think that they were capturing some different studies and then giving this comprehensive look. So the first one is talking about like why you would taper, and it's to get the uptick in performance. It's to get super compensation to occur where you're actually performing at a higher level than what you would get under normal training conditions. Based on that study, or based on that research, it said 0.5 to 6% increase in output could be seen in performance. And I can't remember if this was specific to powerlifting performance or if they were looking just at like individual like muscle strength. So if they had them doing like a biodex or something like that, where it's just like a single joint that is performing this. But I want to say that this was a multi-joint actual lift being performed. Or maybe they were on a force plate, for example. But you could see a 0.5 to 6% increase based on that. And then the how, and this is where I think it's kind of cool, because back in 2015, people were talking about some things that are still popular in powerlifting, such as like a step or a progressive taper approach, where like at 3 weeks out, maybe you reduce volume by 10%. And then the next week, when they're 2 weeks out, you're reducing it by another 20%. And overall, you're getting this really big reduction in training volume across a peaking block. So that's kind of discussing the how here. Another thing that, and this is one that we can definitely go into detail with, but they said very explicitly that training should cease at least 2 days before the targeted competition. We know now, especially as people have become more skilled on bench press specifically, that that would not be a universal recommendation that we could dish out to people.
Yeah.
You know, we've seen the extremes of that where people are doing quote unquote priming sessions hours before they compete, and that's kind of the extreme end of that. But at the time, I thought this was like an absolute capital T truth. You know, I was never going to give somebody a session if they compete on Saturday on a Thursday or Friday, out of fear that that would completely derail the taper there. So, do you have any athletes on your roster that have sort of that like competition day -1 or -2 session where they're getting that priming work in?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely have some with bench press, just because, like you said, we're not just concerned with, well, actually, you didn't really even say this, but it's kind of implied where we're not just worried about fatigue, but we're also worried about adaptations occurring and maintenance of strength. And just because bench press recovers so quickly, like some people are going to benefit from having a lot of their training sessions very close to their heaviest session of the week to make sure that their skill is still elevated. So yeah, I definitely have a few people doing that. As far as like squat or deadlift go, more squat than deadlifts, but I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with having a squat or a deadlift on like a Thursday, especially now in like the current powerlifting sphere where we're starting to get into higher frequency deadlifting and squatting. That's been a thing where that final session or preceding session would probably land pretty close to the competition date.
Right. And yeah, I used to view like super compensation as, and therefore like that uptick in performance, I used to view it as this thing that like you could really screw up if there was any training that happened those last couple days.
Yeah.
You know, I think I even would tell people like, as far as physical activity goes, like really take it easy these last couple days before you step on the platform. And now I'm of the belief that like, no, people should probably maybe even increase their physical activity a little bit just so that their legs don't feel heavy on the day, and like make sure you're walking around. I know if I have people competing at national competitions and they've traveled, I always tell them like, if it's decent outside, go walk around a bit, like let's get moving, because it's not, people's peak performance isn't so sensitive that they can't do some stuff in those last couple days. And like you said, we're even seeing people do that across the board on squat, bench, and deadlift, where they're actually giving prescribed work within that final 48 to 72 hours to maximize performance. So the reduction in volume on here, 30 to 70%, is also recommended on the how. I don't know if that is something that I would recommend for everybody. And it would be dependent on the type of training that we're reducing volume in. I used to be more okay with reducing training volume on the compound movements, the higher specificity work, and anymore, I want to keep that fairly normal, maybe only reducing things a little bit in that final week. And the big reduction in volume typically for me comes from accessory volume, pulling that back so that there's a little bit more chance for recovery. Are you sort of the same way with your approach?
Yeah, definitely. I do view certain accessory work as like for example, some people will use a belt squat as like an additional third squat exposure, or there's some exercise or accessory work throughout the week that's very closely tied to someone's strength being elevated. For example, maybe someone feels really strong when they do dips and on like a secondary bench day or something. I'll want to keep something like that in, maybe like a little bit easier, but things that are typically like back work or isolation work, or I don't want to call it fluff because it's all important, but things that you can get rid of or like really pull back, and it's probably not going to impact your performance too much. I'm definitely pulling those back pretty significantly.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way, where I hate to call it fluff or even like bring attention to this, but yeah, I always explain this to people, especially the collegiate athletes that I work with, because there are like class conflicts to where maybe they can get the first 40 minutes of a 60-minute session in with me, but then they have to bounce. And I always tell them, the way that a session is written, it's always going to be highest priority to lowest priority in that order. So that doesn't mean that the stuff at the bottom isn't important and isn't helpful, but if you miss the last few exercises, it's not going to make or break the protocol. So those like last few things, as far as accessories go, which is usually going to be the isolation single joint sort of movements, those are going to be the first ones on the chopping block. There are some exceptions, and I know we're really getting into the minutia here. But sometimes, like, if I have people that have shoulder, elbow, those sort of issues, I'll keep in some of those isolation movements and just make them super low RPE and high rep for like one set, just as feel good movement for them, so that they feel good going into the meet. But again, we're splitting hairs here. So I think the real take home here that is outdated is that idea that you need to have at least 2 days, and then it says but no more than 1 week prior. I would never ever have somebody not train for a week during a peak phase and then go hit the platform. That would be quite an unorthodox approach. And I shouldn't say never. Maybe in 5 years I'll have tried that and we'll come back to this and regret saying that. But I seriously doubt I would ever have anybody go that long without a training system. So putting these numbers or these percentage increases into a more practical example, I gave some things here where an individual with a 1,200-pound total, based on those percentage increases in output, might see a 36-pound increase in their total if they apply a peaking protocol that's tailored for them. And if you then scale that up to a 1,600-pound total, they might experience a 48-pound increase in their total. And that is above baseline for what their usual output is in training, to be clear. Let me see what this next section says here. Nothing super important and with a lot of grammatical errors, so I do apologize for that. But so I made I thought this was a groundbreaking claim here at the end of this paragraph, where I said, in my opinion, peaking for a particular day should start several months before competing. And this is where we get into this idea of creating a predictable environment via the use of an SPD day. And that would be like a weekend SPD session, because that's typically the day that 99% of the powerlifting population is going to compete, outside of those who are doing like a national or an international level competition where it spans 4 to 5 days. So at this point in time in my coaching career, I was really big on the SPD day, put it on a Saturday or Sunday, typically a Saturday for most people. And the way that I would manipulate it is I would have a lot of changes to the exercise type and the variations that were being performed across a macro cycle as a way to increase specificity as the blocks went on, which you'll see right here. So block 1, block 2, block 3, and block 4 in that order. Block 1 being 16 to 13 weeks out. These are 4-week blocks of training. What I said I would do here as the lowest specificity variation is pause high bar squats, touch and go incline bench press, and the non-competition stance for deadlift. So if they're a sumo puller, they're pulling conventional and vice versa. Also, you'll see that the volume is very high, 5 sets of 7 for each one. I think if I gave this session to a lot of my athletes, they would probably be looking for a different coach pretty quickly. Then it becomes a little bit more tolerable when we get into the block 2, where it becomes paused comp, squat, and deadlift, and then you have a paused incline bench press. And then as time goes on, you start working more and more towards comp specificity here. This, again, is another one, and here's that very important caveat. This is not an exact protocol that you should follow down here. That being said, I was getting kind of close to this in practice. I do remember programming in that way. So this right here, this whole section for me could all be critiqued. I think this is not even close to a protocol that I would give. And I wouldn't, like, let's just take the exercise variation out of the equation here. Okay, let's say that this is comp specific throughout. Comp squat, comp bench, and comp deadlift across the board. I also would not have this really big reduction in volume on a block-to-block basis. Things would be much more mixed in their approach, where maybe it's a top set plus volume back downs or something like that. But the biggest difference, I think, would be you would be getting some high-intensity exposure at that block 1 point. And we would just be looking to make really small increases as the blocks went on. So I see you shaking your head. I'm assuming... I mean, I know how you program because obviously we collaborate a lot on what we do. That also is more in line with your approach based on my understanding of how you typically go about training.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. Like, the way that I kind of view it is that there is going to be a shift in terms of the training variables like specificity, dosage, exercise type, but it's going to be a lot more subtle. And it could be even just as subtle as, not saying you have to do it like this, but a very common example is like you have a top set in all the time, and then you taper it from a triple, double to a single, right? That it can be that subtle versus we're having a shift from what is the total amount of volume, 35 total reps with a completely different exercise versus 5 total reps with a completely different exercise. The response you're going to get from those two protocols is so drastically different. And that's not a bad thing, but just in the context of creating a consistent, predictable, and peaking environment, or even just training environment in general, we would probably want to have, like, a good example that we talk about is, like, it's not an on-off switch, it's a dial that we're subtly shifting to the left or the right.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it's also just, it's very dated in the sense that, like, this would have been around that same time where I believed phase potentiation and, like, block periodization had to exist very strictly. So your hypertrophy phase sets up your strength phase, which sets up your peaking phase. And we know now that hypertrophy doesn't just happen in 8 to 12 rep range. You know, like, it can happen really anywhere as long as the proximity to failure is there and you do have adequate volume from other sources. So even if your volume's down on the compound lifts, you can get hypertrophy from, name the accessor, you know?
Yeah.
So we know that it's much less an on-off switch. Like you said, it is a multifaceted Venn diagram with a really big middle and gray section. Like, these things overlap a lot, and these qualities can be trained at different phases of the training year and ultimately, like, different proximities to a competition. So we could sit here for an hour and critique this. Importantly, I would say this is not something you should follow. It's just a framework that was intentionally sort of exaggerated to show what these different things would look like. So you're seeing specificity in the sense of movement selection. You're seeing specificity in the sense of reps performed per set, and that sort of thing. And then you're also, though it's not set, like, it's not written out here, but you would see specificity increasing via the percentage of 1RM being performed, because as the reps come down at the set relative intensity, you're going to have higher and higher percentages of 1RM being performed. So there are still some good things here. This was intentionally exaggerated, and it is to just draw out kind of what these different things would look like if manipulated across a macro cycle. That's sort of what I go into detail here with for specificity, intensity, volume as well. So let me see this note that I had here. Okay, yeah, another very important note. The volume drop here that is put on display, or that progression, is for this one individual session. It's not for the entire training plan. I put that note in there sort of, well, I also said I wouldn't recommend this significant of one for an athlete, but also to say, you know, it's sort of drawing significance to the fact that you would want to maintain some volume elsewhere in the training plan, even if you're really manipulating this one day to make it more specific across the week. So this is where the predictability comes into play. I'm not going to bore you with the microcycle split. That doesn't really matter too much. Pretty much what I'm getting at, though, in this section is I'm saying you can pretty much use your secondary or tertiary day as an assessment for where output is going to be on your primary day. So using, for example, here with this 3-day or 3-time-a-week protocol for squat, you would use this day one work, that top single at RPE 6, to estimate a 1-rep max. And then you would come back on day 5. So let's say that's Monday and Saturday sessions or Monday and Friday sessions. You'd come back on your day 5, go to a higher RPE, which we would assume would be a higher percentage of 1RM and therefore more relevant for assessing estimated 1-rep max. And you would just look to see what is the difference in 1-rep max between those 2 days. Then what you could look at is the percentage difference, and you could combine the percentage difference in output between those 2 days with the percentage increase we would expect when you run a taper to predict what your meet day performance would be, which is shown down here. So don't know how easy this is to read through, but let's say week 1, day 1, this is your estimated 1RM, 500 pounds. Based on the top single you hit then on your day 5, your estimated 1RM is 506. So it's 1.2% higher than your day 1 estimated 1RM is. We collect that over the course of a block or two, and we get the average percentage change from your day 1 to your day 5. So for this example, it was 1.143%. Again, these are all like really big hypotheticals, but let's say that you're in the normal range for responders when it comes to a taper. So you're either 0.5% increase above your standard or 6% increase above your standard training output after you've performed a taper. So what you would do then is you would combine this 1.143% with something in that range that is 0.5 to 6%, and that would give you anywhere between a 1.643 and a 7.143% increase in top end strength after a taper. That's a lot of numbers that I just threw at you. So pretty much the short summary here, hopefully it's short, is we could use a secondary day to compare to the primary day to see how much better are you performing on your primary day. And then we can combine that normal increase that we would see under normal training conditions with what we would expect from a volume taper to then kind of plan out your attempts accordingly. So does that make sense, Skyler?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure. Hopefully other people get it. I know I would expect you to because we've talked about this a little bit, but hopefully it's not lost in translation here. So let's see. For attempt selection, honestly, I might just link this article so people can read through this because I think I'm going to confuse the hell out of them. I will certainly do that, but it talks through an example of attempt selection here. So what I was suggesting is you could keep the secondary day during meet week the same. So on Monday, you're still working up to a single in like that RP 6 to 8 range on the competition lift. You then calculate a max from there. In this example, they hit 500 for one at an RPE 8. They got a calculated estimated 1-rep max of 534 pounds. We would then take the normal percentage increase that we would see. This is that 1.143% right here. and we would add 3% to that, and we would tack on an extra 22 pounds to their estimated 1 RM based on the usual rhythm that we would see across the microcycle. So if we take their estimated 1 rep max from what they hit on day 1 of meet week, we add the 22.12 pounds to it, the anticipated third attempt is going to be somewhere around 556 pounds. Do I think that's accurate? Absolutely not. This is another thing I'd critique here. If I had an athlete hit 500 for 1 in an RP8 and it was like a true RP8, I'm maybe taking 535 to 545 for a third attempt, maybe. And that's like if they're being really honest with their RPE logging on their sheet here, and the training footage checks out. Like, without any additional information, Skyler, what are you saying? If somebody sends you a true RP8 500 single on squat, what are we going for the third attempt, do you think?
Probably not 556.
We're not tagging 25 keys on it, I don't think.
Gonna have to have the talk of talking down expectations a little bit, the classic conversation.
Right. Yeah, and that's so this, based on the tapering research that I referenced, that 3% addition is the normal according to the research. That would be amazing if I had somebody do this. Like, that would be a stupidly high responder to tapering and peaking. So again, I think I actually remember trying to apply this and trying to use it with athletes, and it didn't work well. But at the time, it felt like the best way to create a predictable environment for training and peaking for my athletes. And I think, let me just make sure I'm not missing anything else of relevance here. Nothing crazy, no. So I'll leave it at that for now. Like I said, I'll link this article so people can read through it and maybe look to apply this if they want to try their hand at it too. But the thing that I do feel is applicable still, and I wonder if you've tried this at all with any of your athletes, is this idea of using a secondary day or tertiary, whatever we want to call it, to then predict how the primary day is going to show up. I can speak about my experience first if you want to with that. Just weigh your answer. I have tried it at times, and what I've realized more and more as I've been coaching is, in a vacuum, if we were coaching robots, no external variables are going to affect them, I think a model like this actually holds up super well. And I think it would actually hold up perfectly with very, very little uncertainty or unpredictability in it. Having worked with humans, I realize that this is far too simplistic of a view of things, and it's way too narrow-minded to actually hold up at all times. And by that I mean, I've had so many times where we've had every marker looking really good. We've seen secondary days performing well. It showed up super well, and the week 4 or 5 or whatever week it may be, and we're just thinking, oh, this person's going to blow up their primary day. All signs are pointing towards great performance on that primary day. And then inevitably it goes horribly and they don't perform well. And it's for sometimes very clear reasons. External variables are clearly not working in their favor. They're not recovered. If we think SRA curve, they're below baseline, and so we don't see that positive adaptation occur where we would expect it to usually be. Or sometimes it just seems random, and we can't actually pinpoint exactly why the coveted really big primary day we thought we were going to have didn't show up. So that's been my experience. Now, again, there are a few examples I can think of where it has worked really well, and this model is great. But it's just, I think it is a little bit narrow-minded and short-sighted to just assume that you can always create a predictable environment when working with powerlifters.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I thought there was like a bird in my little area over there. I was like looking over, like, what is going on? But Jesus, coughing too. We're gonna have to.
You're good.
We're
saying it's allergy season still.
It's out, yeah. So the allergy monster's in here, but yeah, no, definitely. Like, I've never really used like I guess we'll call it like an indicator set on like a secondary and say, oh, this is going to equate to X percentage increase on my primary day by any means. But like, I guess it's kind of it's related in a way, but maybe sort of a tangent off of the current topic, but I will look at secondary days as like an indication of what's going on throughout the week, at least, when we're viewing an SRA curve, right? Like if in the example that you gave where you have a secondary, tertiary, primary, those 2 days are going really, really well, and then it just doesn't show up on that primary day, that could be something in the case where we're not carrying the training stimulus or like the adaptations over to your primary day. And then, we can even view it as a continuation where it's like, okay, something's going on where the primary is making the secondary days feel better, but then the secondary days don't lead to that. It's almost like an inverse or incorrect SRA curve. So it's like we can still get good information without, in the absence of like some type of indicator comparison set. We can just compare performance and say, why is this occurring on the days that we don't want it to? And then we can then refine that process to have more predictable training outcomes. Hopefully that answers the question, but yeah, cool. So not really looking at like two singles and I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to use this as a marker, but there is valuable data to be drawn throughout the week.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we've been talking recently about the modern obsession with the primary day.
Yes.
And how people, and it seems like it's always the week 4 primary day that people are like, if that doesn't go to plan, the entire training plan is, throw it in the trash bin and move on. Like you have to completely uproot everything. That's just not the case, Mm-hmm. And we're both aware of that. And I think most coaches are also aware of that. Yeah. It's just not, primary days are always just a proxy for where development is. And we try to set up the training week to make it to where that day can consistently show up. It doesn't always happen that way, whether it's the training itself, if it's the stuff going on outside of training. Sometimes those days just don't show up how we would expect. So that's perfectly fine. But one thing I do like a lot about this idea of creating predictable training via assessing those secondary and tertiary days is it almost, the way that I wrote those like theoretical microcycles and what a progression would look like, if you were running with a system like that, it would kind of force the lifter to put a bit more effort into those secondary sessions. Mm-hmm. Because I think the modern obsession is to do the opposite. It is to do the least amount of work and hope that you're not carrying fatigue into the primary day. And that is, in the short term, a great idea. That's cool. Yeah, if we pull back training stress, you're probably going to see an uptick in your primary day. Okay, yeah, that's called tapering. We just went over that. Long term, though, you miss out on so much opportunity if that is all that you base your training decisions on.
Yeah.
So I do like that, and that was not the intention with writing that article whatsoever. But just, again, trying to tie it into where is this applicable in modern powerlifting programming and training. That is one of my biggest critiques of the modern approach, is that people are a little obsessive with the primary day and not putting enough effort in to actually continue bumping up the primary day. We've talked about floor and ceiling analogies before, and I actually believe on the hypertrophy video that you posted to the YouTube channel that this is going to be uploaded to, you talked about how hypertrophy work is the raising of the floor that then will allow you to actually get the ceiling a bit higher. So I know you actually told me recently you were hoping to do a little bit more educational content on this specific obsession with the primary day.
Yes.
And the week 4 obsession. So do you want to speak on that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. It's like kind of going back to what we talked about earlier in the video. It's this misunderstanding that we're only trying to manage fatigue, but we're kind of forgetting that you actually need to train hard enough to have something to recover from, and trying to emphasize end of block outcomes and trying to peak all the time. You essentially adopt this, not just mindset, but also a training approach where you're not really doing anything to get stronger. So what you'll typically see when people are really hyper obsessive about their end of block top set, week 4 or 5, whatever it is, they're taking the minimum on their secondaries. They're not pushing their accessories very hard, and they're doing everything in their power to stay fresh. So they get to the end of the block and they're touching their ceiling, but the problem is that in the short term, your ceiling's not going to go up. You're just going to be consistently touching it. In the long term, though, in my opinion, I think what we kind of forget about is that you're actually probably going to detrain in a way where your capacity for training, and you're honestly probably going to lose some muscle size in some ways if you're sandbagging accessories all the time. And that's going to make you weaker in the long run, where, again, we're not just concerned with staying fresh. We need to have a large part of our training year be towards just getting bigger and stronger. And I think a big thing that people forget is, like, you know, when you push your accessories, when you push your secondaries, your developmental work, you're probably not going to be extremely fresh for your primary top set. And it's going to be dampened a little bit. And that 5 to 10 pound drop, that's such an amazing trade-off for getting humongously jacked, getting a much bigger work capacity. So when you do get into that peaking phase and you kind of drop some of the training stress off, do some of this like golden microcycle, week 4 peak stuff, it actually pans out extremely well and you get a lot out of it.
Yeah. I think you and I kind of exist in a happy medium between the really dated programming approach and the super modern one. And I mean, that's how biased of a statement was that, right? But I do think that we do a pretty good job of balancing the two, where we understand and honestly, it's probably more to do with like the athlete's psychological side of things. You know, we want to keep them engaged, and they need, though not instant gratification, it can't be but so delayed. You know, they need to see progress happening in some ways. But we also understand that like the dated approach with phase potentiation and block periodization probably had some validity, because it did at least place a big emphasis on non-specific hypertrophy work.
Yep.
And that emphasis was to potentiate later performance in the high specificity activity. So I think we understand, like, at times it might not be all about the top set and pushing it. It might be maintaining the same load on the top set and pushing all the other stuff, actually.
Yep.
And depending on the proximity to competition and the overall context for that lifter, that might be the best thing to set them up for success 3 blocks later. Mm-hmm. And I don't really care what happens with the top set in that first block. You know, obviously I don't want to see a huge regression to where we're like digging ourselves a giant hole we can't get out of.
Right.
But I'm okay with not pushing peak exposure as well, you know, or peak intensity exposure. So I think the thing to kind of tie this all together is, you know, that understanding that the best approach is probably the one that sees value in that phase potentiation approach, while also understanding that modern powerlifters need some tangible sense of progress as they're training.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons for that too is because it is the norm. You know, the common, most popular approach is one where we have these big week 4s and people are regularly hitting PRs. Like, that is something that happens a lot for people. You know, you'll always see people posting these crazy videos. And because we are human, it's very hard to sit idly by and watch that happen while doing all this foundational, like, hypertrophy and general strength work.
Yeah.
And just, you know, it's difficult to just trust that what you're doing is going to pay off in 4 to 6 months. So if we can find a balanced approach between the old and the new, that's probably the sweet spot, I would say. And I imagine people are going to kind of, the pendulum will swing and sort of settle in the middle. And I think it may have done that some. I've seen more coaches acknowledging the importance of hypertrophy work and understanding that it's not all about comp specificity, but I do think there's still some room for improvement, and that's not just for everybody else. I'm sure that we could improve our approach too, but I think taking a look back at some of the older stuff I've written, and even some like the archive posts I have on my Instagram that I just wholly disagree with, it's cool because it makes you think about where you're at now. You know, maybe you were hitting the sweet spot years ago and you should start applying that sort of thing again. So I would encourage everybody to do that if you've done any sort of content creation or written anything for Instagram or whatever social media platform. Go back and just take a look to see what you have done and how far you've come, and maybe, you know, certain good things that you kind of forgot that you've done. So I don't know if that's a good closing message. Skyler, was there anything else you wanted to touch base on regarding this topic, or?
I think that kind of capped it off pretty well. Kind of hit the nail on the head there, man.
Cool. So you can see how polished we are and how good, how media trained we are with that very clean conclusion to the conversation. But I mean, we're gonna have plenty more content coming out. Just I know we wanted to follow up on the hypertrophy video, Skyler, and talk more about that. We could save that for a separate video today. But yeah, go ahead, give us a follow here on YouTube. Follow us on Instagram, of course, and follow both Skyler and I on Instagram. Skyler, you are Skyler_Holt 321. Is that right?
Yep.
Nailed it. Great. And I have systematic_strength on Instagram. We'll link those in the description of this video as well. Thanks for watching, y'all, and we'll be talking to you soon.